As a content creator who's made hundreds of videos and reels, I understand how frustrating and time consuming it can be to adjust your camera settings for different platforms. In this video, I'll share the best camera settings to streamline your workflow so that you can create high quality YouTube videos and effortlessly convert them into vertical shorts or reels. This way you can save time, produce more content, and maintain a consistent look across all of your social media platforms.
You gotta just press record.
Hi everybody, Craig Pruitt with Think Media. We have 8 settings we're gonna cover in this video, so let's just dive right into the first one, which you probably are doing incorrectly. This is your frame rate. You probably heard maybe that 24 frames per second is the best. It creates the most cinematic image, and it is great. I love 24 FPS, but 30 frames per second is by far the best frame rate for social media platforms, and it's also a great frame rate for YouTube as well. This mainly has to deal with refresh rate. So an iPhone tends to refresh its screen at 60 Hertz. So a 30 frames per second video clip is gonna play back a lot more smoothly than a 24 frames per second video clip would on an iPhone device. So if you wanna repurpose your YouTube content for other social media platforms, I highly encourage you to get out of 24 frames per second and start shooting in 30 FPS. The second tip is to manually set your shutter speed. And since we have set now our frame rate to 30 frames per second, we need to adjust our shutter speed accordingly. We always want our shutter speed to be double our frame rate to get the appropriate motion blur. So we're gonna set our shutter speed to 1/60. This is 1/60th of a second, which is the ideal shutter speed when you're shooting in 30 frames per second. This is really easy to accomplish. You just gotta make sure your camera is set to manual exposure so you can manually set that shutter speed. So we have our frame rate and our shutter speed correct. Now we need to talk about resolution. When it comes to selecting your resolution for your main widescreen shot, I'd highly encourage you to shoot in 4K resolution if at all possible. With your 4K shot, I'd also encourage you to frame up your shot about 3 to 5% wider than you might normally do, which is gonna give you a little bit more room and flexibility for creating those vertical shorts later. When it comes time for repurposing content for shorts, we're gonna be making 1080p clips. The reason we're choosing to use 1080p as our resolution size is because none of the short form platforms are even optimized to play back 4K resolution in their shorts feeds. Even if you upload a 4K vertical short to something like Instagram, they will instantly create a 1080p version to display to its viewers. Several of the platforms explicitly state that the highest resolution that they will play back is 1080p, so we're just gonna optimize right away for that 1080p format. So by recording content this way, you get a high quality widescreen clip that you can publish to YouTube, and then you can create vertical shorts that are 1080p resolution really easily. But how do we make sure that our framing of our vertical shorts are gonna be correct? Well, this is where our fourth tip comes in, which is setting aspect ratio guides. A lot of cameras allow you to add a guide on the display for a 9:16 aspect ratio. So for example, on the FX3, I use this 9:16 marker option a lot so I can make sure that my framing is correct for vertical platforms if I'm gonna repurpose that content later. And if your camera doesn't have this marker display option, you can actually turn on a different setting, which is your square grid line display. Most cameras have this grid line display, and then you can make sure that your point of interest falls within the middle 2 rows of these squares. Those middle 2 rows roughly equal a 9:16 marker, so just make sure you frame yourself up in those squares and you should be good to go. Also, a lot of camera monitors have a 9:16 aspect guide on them, so you can also use this as an option if you have a camera monitor. So if you set up your aspect guides correctly, and then you take, like, for example, a long form podcast episode and you threw it into something like Opus Clip, which then uses AI to spit out 10 to 20 shorts from your long form podcast episode, you will have already thought through the framing of your image for the social media platforms, and you don't have to go in and rescale everything to a different size. You won't get any weird cropping where your head gets cut off or your arms get cut off or something like that, because you've already ensured by using your marker displays that you framed up your image correctly. Our fifth tip is to turn on focus breathing compensation. Sony has added this feature to a lot of their newer Alpha series cameras. By turning this setting on, it really minimizes that slight zooming effect that occurs when you're adjusting focus, which leaves you then with a more consistent frame free from distracting shifts in your composition. This is really helpful because when you convert content to vertical formats, you're emphasizing a smaller portion of the frame, which then can accentuate that unwanted focus breathing effect that a lot of more affordable camera lenses tend to have. So be sure to turn on this option if you have the feature. Our sixth tip is to turn on touch tracking. You obviously want to keep your image in focus, and the best way to do this is with touch tracking. Most of these camera manufacturers, from Canon to Sony to Nikon or Fuji, have some sort of touch tracking feature that allows you to select a subject just by touching the camera screen, which gives you continuous and precise focus on yourself or your subject when you're recording content. So no matter where I move in the frame, I know that my eye eye is being tracked and I have peace of mind knowing that I'm always going to be in focus, whether it's for my long form piece of content or my short form videos. Our seventh tip is to lock in a really solid picture profile that looks great in camera so that you have to do little to no color grading in post-production. This tip is really an efficiency piece so that you can, as quickly as possible, have your long form video dialed in and ready to export for long form platforms, and then you can quickly start repurposing that content for social media. The way you set up your picture profiles and the color in your camera really is all just based around personal preference and the way that you like your images to look. If you want to use my settings, I'll share with you the exact settings that I use for my picture profile to record this video, right? So I shoot on Sony cameras and I tend to use the S Cinetone profile because the image looks really great straight out of camera, but I also adjust a couple of the custom settings. I go into my black level and I subtract that to -1 just to get a little bit darker blacks because I love contrast in my image, so I just lower that to -1. I also find that S Cinetone is a little bit less saturated than I personally prefer, so I increase my saturation to +2, and then I increase my detail. Usually it comes set to -5, and I just increase that back up to -1 to add a little bit more detail back into my image. By leveraging these settings, I get a really beautiful image with that S Cinetone profile, but also add a little bit of my personal flavor by upping the contrast a little bit and adding a little bit more saturation. And again, the reason why I do this is to save me time later so I don't have to spend a bunch of time color grading, and I can just get that long form video out and then convert it quickly to the short form platforms as well. And our final tip is to manually set your white balance. I see way too many people using the auto white balance setting, which then allows your camera to shift white balance during your recording, and it honestly just looks pretty bad. So you're gonna wanna set a custom white balance depending on your lighting scene. So for my scene right now, I'm shooting with daylight colored temperature lights. That daylight temperature is 5600 Kelvin. So I need to set the Kelvin temperature, the white balance on my camera to 5600 Kelvin to compensate for the color temperature of my lights. If you're just in your house using natural lighting overhead that's a little bit more warmer, there's a chance that those lights are tungsten colored lights, which is closer to 3200 Kelvin. So you could set your white balance in your camera to 3200 Kelvin. And then if you're in sort of mixed lighting conditions and there's daylight coming in as well as overhead lighting that's a little bit more warm, you could try to set your white balance to something in between, like 4200 Kelvin for these mixed lighting conditions. But no matter the case, you just want to make sure you're manually setting your white balance, because if you leave it on auto, you run the risk of that white balance shifting during your recording session. And this is something that you cannot get rid of in post-production. All right, I know those are some really specific settings, but again, we're optimizing your camera, not just for YouTube, but also for repurposing content for all of the platforms and for just having an efficiency mindset. So when you put all this together, you are left with a wonderfully shot widescreen 4K video that you can then seamlessly convert to vertical format and have peace of mind knowing that you have optimized your video file to succeed on both kinds of platforms. If you're wanting to get your studio space dialed in for recording content, then click or tap the screen right here to watch this video that highlights 10 essentials that every YouTube studio needs. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.